Hey, sweet friend, and welcome back to Migraine Relief Hotline. I'm Kelli, the migraine dietitian. This is Ollie, and each week I'll be bringing you answers to your biggest migraine questions so you can feel more confident and in control. We're being joined with Ollie, aka Bear. For those of you just listening, he is our cat. He's the middle child. And he's definitely one of our snuggliest, so he'll be joining us today. Also, apologies if I sound a little bit stuffy. I am. I am a little bit stuffy. I'm still getting over whatever I was sick with last week. It was not COVID, thank goodness, but something got me. And I'm still dealing with some of that like yucky sinus congestion and kind of a scratchy throat. So bear with me. I may not sound fully 100% today, but I'm gonna do my best. And before we dive into today's question, which is about figuring out and managing triggers for migraine, great topic. I wanted to thank y'all again for all of your support for the show, for leaving reviews and sharing, joining the Patreon. I really, really appreciate that. And I love seeing y'all enjoy the show. So keep it up, keep, telling your friends, keep rating, reviewing, sharing on your Instagram stories when you listen. It really helps the show grow and reach more people, and it also really makes my day. So I appreciate it, y'all, and I'm happy you're here. All right, now let's get into today's question. A quick note before we begin, I am a dietitian, but I am not your dietitian. All of the information in today's episode is intended for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for medical advice. Always consult your healthcare provider before making any changes to your healthcare routine. All right, so today's question comes from Maxine, and Maxine asked, how do I actually start identifying my migraine triggers? And I'm sure a lot of you are going, yes, oh my gosh. Tell me, because it can be a struggle to figure out what your triggers are, right? Because the same thing may not always bother you. So we are going to talk about triggers today, but if you know me, you know I have to insert some other things in here too, because one of the biggest mistakes that I see people make is assuming that if they track enough when it comes to migraine and migraine triggers, that they'll find like the one thing that's triggering their attacks, the one thing that they need to avoid. And it just doesn't work like that. It's just not that simple, unfortunately. Typically, it's going to be a combination of different factors that push your body over that threshold, that migraine threshold, which is when you experience an attack. So for those of you who aren't super familiar with the idea of threshold theory or migraine threshold theory, I will explain it to you super quickly here, and we can even do an entire episode on this if you want to learn more. But the idea of migraine threshold theory is that we all have a threshold for migraine. And what's a threshold? It's something that you cross over, right? So whenever we cross over our migraine threshold, that's when we experience an attack. Now, some people have a low threshold, which is bad. Low threshold is bad, okay? We want a high threshold because a low threshold means it's going to take way fewer triggers to push us over that threshold. So if you imagine it in your head, or if you're watching me, you can see our threshold may be halfway across our head, right? And every time we're exposed to triggers, they build up like little rocks, right? Stacked on top of each other until eventually all of those triggers pass over that threshold, that imaginary line, and we experience an attack, right? So a low threshold, not going to take that many triggers to cause us to experience an attack, versus a high threshold. It's going to take a lot more trigger exposure and more significant triggers to affect us. So that's why we want a high threshold. Now, when it comes to actual triggers, it is good to be aware of what your triggers are. Now, disclaimer, if you have a super low threshold, it's going to be difficult. It's going to feel like everything triggers a migraine attack because you're so sensitive to triggers. So again, if you want me to talk more about threshold and how to raise that, let me know, submit a question, and we can totally go over that together. Because if you're in that place where you're just feeling so sensitive and like everything triggers you, we got to focus on threshold. It's also really important to remember that triggers are very individual. So sometimes we can get stuck in this trap of looking online, seeing what other people's triggers are, reading lists of foods we're supposed to avoid, right? Because they're migraine triggers for everybody. This is just not the case. With all migraine triggers, they're going to be very individual. For instance, some people are really affected by hormone fluctuations, others aren't. Some people are really triggered by weather changes and others aren't. And it's like this for everything. So it's really important to keep that in mind. Try not to get too obsessive and honestly freaked out about all the different possible triggers, because odds are you're only going to truly experience a handful of them. And even those that you are affected by, we can improve your sensitivity to them, again, by raising your overall threshold. All right, so I've collected a list of the most common patterns of triggers that I see working with, hundreds of people who have migraine. So I'm going to list these out for you and you can start to see which ones you might relate to. So first we've got blood sugar and blood sugar fluctuations. So skipping meals, eating too little protein with meals or too little fiber, going too long without eating carb-heavy meals without other stuff added. Those all fall into the blood sugar drop category. Next, we have alcohol and caffeine. All right, so alcohol, especially red wine and certain liquors for some people, but can be any and all alcohol. And then caffeine fluctuations. Too much caffeine, skipping caffeine if you drink it every day, or some people are just super sensitive to caffeine in the first place. Those are different patterns that we see. Hormonal shifts is a big one. So estrogen drops before your period and around ovulation, perimenopause fluctuations, irregular period fluctuations caused by hormone imbalances. These are all potential hormone-related trigger patterns. Next, we have weather changes. Yes, weather can be a big trigger for people, so you're not crazy. This is definitely a thing. Barometric pressure drops, air pressure, right? Storms, high humidity, sudden temperature swings, high heat, low heat. All of these can be triggers. Now, will all of them be a trigger for you? Probably not, but one or two totally could be. Next, we've got sensory overload. This is a big one for yours truly. So we're talking about bright lights, strong smells, or even certain smells. Flickering lights, like if you're driving in the car and the sun's flickering through the trees, that can be a big one for some people. Loud noises, certain types of noises, that can be a big trigger. Next is sleep issues, okay? So this could be too little sleep. It can also be too much sleep. Even if you're getting, 8 or 9 hours, if it's not good quality sleep, that can contribute to migraine attacks. And then also an irregular sleep schedule. So if you're going to bed and waking up at all different kinds of times every day, or if you're going to bed and waking up at a different time on weekdays versus weekends, that can be an issue too. Next one is everyone's favorite, stress, right? A big trigger for a lot of us. So attacks triggered by high stress, attacks triggered by a sudden release of stress, or what we call letdown attacks or weekend attacks. Even chronic low-level stress can be an issue. Next, we've got dehydration and electrolyte imbalances. This is a big one for a lot of us. So not drinking enough water, missing key electrolytes like sodium, potassium, magnesium, chloride, calcium. There are lots of electrolytes that we need. So even if you're pretty good with water, if you're low on electrolytes, it's going to affect your nervous system and can be a pretty big migraine trigger. Next one is neck tension and posture, and I'm going to throw in there like general work-related stuff too. So screen time, staring at screens for hours and hours every day. I'm guilty of this one. It can also be your posture at your desk. So if you're hunched over, or if your chair is too low or too high, if you're looking down at your screen, all of these things can play a role in triggering attacks. But also we're thinking about our posture in general. Are we holding a lot of stress and tension in our neck and shoulders? All of these can act as triggers. And everyone's favorite, food triggers. Yes, food triggers are a very real thing. Does everyone have food triggers? No, actually, not everyone does. And are everyone's food triggers kind of within the same group of foods? No, they're not. So when it comes to food triggers, try not to put too much weight into those lists you'll read online where it tells you have to avoid like cheese and wine and aged foods and nitrates and histamines and tyramine and all of these different things. Try to tune that out to a certain extent because food triggers are unique. You might react to some of those foods. You might react to none of them. You might react to foods that aren't even on those lists. I'm going to walk you through how to figure this out, okay? So that's going to be our next section here. So where do you start when you're trying to identify your triggers? Now that we have an idea of all of the different possibilities of migraine triggers, and honestly, there are probably more that I forgot. What do we do to figure out our actual triggers? Step one, I find it's helpful to look for patterns instead of single events. It's going to help reduce anxiety. It's going to help you not make your life so small. It's really easy to think, all right, I'm getting a migraine attack. I just ate plums and I haven't eaten plums in forever. That must have been it, right? That must have been the trigger. Or, I'm dealing with this horrible migraine attack. I had, a piece of chocolate earlier. I know I shouldn't have done that. That's why I have this migraine attack. Let's try to avoid doing that, okay? Because we're looking for patterns. Eating a food once and experiencing an attack after it once is nothing. We're not putting any weight into that, okay? We need to see patterns. So, if you eat that plum and you have an attack, you need to think, okay, I'm going to make a little note of that, a neutral note. I'm going to stay curious. And next time I eat a plum, I'm just going to keep a lookout. We're not expecting an attack. We're just observing. I know that can be really hard. And if this is something that you really struggle with and you have a lot of anxiety around, I do highly recommend working with a dietitian, especially, someone like myself who specializes in migraine. It's really helpful to have that guidance, okay? So don't struggle with this stuff on your own if it's really overwhelming you and really affecting your quality of life. And of course, we're thinking about patterns with things other than just food, right? So weather changes, stress, dehydration, all that other stuff we talked about, we're still looking for patterns. Now, when looking at patterns, you also want to think backwards a little bit, right? So not just the meal before or what happened right before. Sometimes we can have a delayed reaction to triggers. So a good example of this that I see a lot with my clients is exercise. So if you're someone who exercises, later in the day, like maybe in the afternoon or even, in the evening, you might not experience a migraine attack if that's a trigger for you until later the next day. So just keep that in mind too. You want to look backwards a little bit when you're looking for those patterns. Now, another thing you can do is you want to look for those few categories that seem to really consistently be an issue for you. Maybe focus mostly on those and leave the other stuff for later, right? Because if we're really looking for it, we're going to find probably a lot of things that affect us in some way when it comes to migraine. So it's helpful to have a little bit of a focus, right? And then of course we've got to talk about tracking, like how to keep up with all of this stuff, with all the different possible triggers and your symptoms and what you're eating and all of that. But we want to do it in a way that's not going to drive you absolutely insane and that doesn't lend itself to obsession. So honestly, I would recommend trying to do this in phases. If you're wanting to figure out if you have any food triggers, I'd recommend keeping a food and symptom journal. Okay, so focus on that first for a little bit. Even just a couple of weeks or 3 weeks can give you a good idea of what your patterns are. So if there are any foods that consistently bother you. So do that first, keep track of as much as you can and as much detail as you can, everything you eat, and then how you feel. Whether you feel good or bad, whether you feel migraine-y or fine, whether you have a headache and you're not sure if it's a migraine attack, or whether you're a little bit lightheaded and you're not sure if it's going to turn into something, keep track of all of that stuff because that'll help you see patterns. Now, if you're not as worried about food or if you've already tracked food, then I would also think about lifestyle. So maybe you want to track your stress and your symptoms. Maybe you want to track weather patterns and your symptoms. I'd really recommend focusing on just a few categories at a time so you're not getting overwhelmed and your entire day isn't consumed by tracking different triggers. So go back if you need to rewind and listen to all the different categories that I mentioned. If any stick out to you, pick 1 or 2 and focus on tracking those. Now, if you're already getting overwhelmed by all of this, I'm going to give you a short, sweet, to the point way that you can track, okay? And this will be a really good starting point for you. Or if this is all you do, it's going to give you some good information. Just write down 3 things each day. 3 things. How you felt that day: energized, overwhelmed, migrainey, headachy, dizzy, nauseous, like just brain dump. How did you feel that day? The next thing 2, any big changes that day. Weird weather, a storm, skipping a meal, eating something new, or if you're about to start your period soon, poor sleep, sleeping in, things like that. You get the point. If you had a migraine attack, how bad was it? However you like to rate them. Some people use a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 5. Some people use the green, yellow, red system, the stoplight system. Just make sure it resonates with you, because this is for you, right? So if you're thinking about getting into tracking, or if you're wanting to restart it, if you've done it before, make sure it is a way that's going to work for you, that you can be consistent with, and isn't causing you extra stress. We don't want this to be a migraine trigger in itself. So adjust it to fit your needs, track in a way that makes sense for you, do it for a few weeks, and move on. And if you're still feeling overwhelmed, this is exactly what I help people with. Please feel free to reach out, okay? Because this is the kind of thing that we talk about and figure out in Raise Your Threshold. You don't have to do this by yourself. There is support available for you. So please reach out if you're feeling overwhelmed and you need help. Well, that is it for today's episode, all about figuring out triggers. So I hope you found it helpful. If you did, don't forget to subscribe if you aren't already. Please leave a review if you haven't already, and share it with someone who you feel could also find it helpful. And if you have a question you want me to answer on the podcast, you can find the link to submit that question in the show notes. For exclusive bonus content, you can also join our Patreon, which is linked in the show notes. And if you are wanting to talk more with me about getting support and working with me inside Raise Your Threshold, or like lab testing, other resources, you can find that information in the show notes. And you can also just DM me on Instagram at the.migraine.dietitian. Thank you for listening, and I will see you on next week's episode. Bye.